My name is Deborah Lawson, and for as long as I can remember, silence was the only way to keep peace in my family. Every time my father told people I'd given up, I nodded, smiled, and let the lie sit between us like an old wound no one wanted to touch. It started small, a joke at dinners, a story he repeated at every gathering, until the lie became who I was in his eyes. I thought enduring it quietly was strength, that keeping harmony mattered more than being understood. But grief changes what silence means. Standing there, listening to him say those same words at my brother's memorial, something in me finally broke. I realized the peace I'd been protecting was never mine. That was the moment I stopped being the quiet one in the story he wrote. And though he didn't know it yet, the truth was already walking toward him, wearing my name. Charleston was wrapped in a heavy morning fog when I arrived, the kind that softens everything except memory. The air tasted of salt and rust, and the distant horn of a ship cut through the quiet like a familiar ache I had spent years trying to forget. Outside the memorial hall, the flag swayed against the wind, slow and deliberate. Inside, rows of uniforms filled every seat, the polished shoes of my brother's former comrades gleaming beneath the lights. On the stage stood a wooden frame draped with the folded colors of our country, and inside it, Jacob's smile, frozen in the moment before his last deployment. I took a seat in the back, where shadows were thicker and questions fewer. No uniform, no insignia, nothing that tied me to the world I'd once belonged to. Just a dark coat, quiet shoes, and a steady breath. The fewer eyes that found me, the better. My father's voice echoed through the microphone, steady, proud, and practiced, the same tone he once used to command an entire crew. "My son, Jacob," he began, "is the pride of our family." He followed the call that runs in the blood of every Lawson man. He paused, glancing down the rows. "And my daughter, well, she tried her hand at the Navy once. Some people just aren't built for that kind of pressure." A few polite laughs rippled through the hall. Even in grief, people still needed something to laugh at. I kept my spine straight, hands resting on my knees. No one here knew that among them sat someone who had worn stars on her shoulders once. I didn't turn toward him. I didn't need to. Years of training had taught me how to remain still when stillness was the strongest answer. The master of ceremony moved on. The band began to play, the deep rhythm of the drums blending with the waves outside. I stared at the flag above Jacob's picture, and the sound took me back, to the blinding light off a steel deck, to the smell of oil, to the static-filled radio that once carried my voice into a storm. I closed my eyes. I hadn't come here to be seen. I came to say goodbye, to the brother who died following a plan written by my own hand. And somewhere deep inside, I felt it, the truth, restless and alive, pressing against the walls I had built to keep it silent. It would not stay buried much longer. I grew up in Charleston, a town that worshipped pride as much as it feared failure. My father was a ship captain, a man of precision, certainty, and hierarchy. To him, worth only existed if someone else witnessed it. I was quiet, deliberate, the kind of child who measured before speaking, and that made me an outlier in his world. When I was accepted into officer candidate school in Rhode Island, he didn't congratulate me. He just said not to make a spectacle of myself. I left before dawn the next morning, my suitcase clicking against the porch steps. Training broke most people in the first month. The pain wasn't physical, it was isolation. You learn to rely on rhythm, on breath, on orders, and slowly. I understood something my father never would. Discipline isn't about obedience, it's about endurance. 2 years later, I was reassigned to the Office of Naval Intelligence, a branch built on secrecy. My work was quiet, analytical, invisible. I studied maps, intercepted transmissions, and created plans no one could ever know I wrote. During Christmas leave, I called home. My father asked where I was. I told him I couldn't say. He asked what I did. I told him I analyzed data. His voice went flat. "Sounds like clerical work." A week later, my aunt mentioned he'd told everyone I'd left the Navy. I didn't bother correcting her. Silence was the price of loyalty. Years passed in windowless rooms filled with screens and static. There were no medals, no handshakes, only the quiet relief of success. I learned how to disappear. And in that vanishing act, I found strength. One evening, a name caught my eye on an internal dispatch. Loti? Jacob Lawson. Accepted into the Navy SEALs. My brother. I smiled, thinking maybe one of us had finally become the kind of hero my father could understand. I didn't know then how close our paths would cross, or how devastating that crossing would be. They called it Operation Meridian, a hijacked civilian vessel off the Yemeni coast, 9 hostages, armed pirates. My name appeared only as initials in the command file. Rear Ad. D. L. I led the mission from a cold, dim room, surrounded by satellite feeds and the metallic hum of computers. Every call, every order had to be precise. Hours later, the final report came through. Operation successful. 9 civilians rescued. 1 casualty. Lit. Jacob Lawson. The air left my body. The hum of the machines grew louder, almost human. My brother, alive in every childhood memory, had died inside a plan I created. I didn't cry. I signed the file, added 1 final line. Mission completed. Accepting full responsibility. 2 months later, the Navy promoted me. At the ceremony, General Cole leaned in close. "Your silence saved more lives than speeches ever could," he said. I answered, "They'll never understand." He smiled. "One day, they will." I wanted to believe him, but belief was a luxury I'd long abandoned. Years later, his name appeared again, on an envelope inviting me to Jacob's memorial service. That was the day I realized the truth I had buried was finally coming for me. I never expected to see the Navy's SEAL again, not after all these years of trying to live as though that part of me had been buried at sea. Yet that morning, a thick envelope marked Department of the Navy, Confidential, waited on my doorstep in Arlington. It was thin, but it carried the weight of everything I'd spent my life avoiding. I poured coffee, slid it open, and slid the papers out. The report inside was one I knew by heart, but had never read again. Operation Meridian, the mission that had cost me more than any other. My signature still sat at the bottom of the page, crisp and sharp. Beneath it, a single line had been added. Casualty. L'État. Jacob Lawson. Under direct command of Rear Admiral D. Lawson. My name beside his. Command and consequence. A perfect equation written in ink that would never fade. At the bottom of the stack lay another envelope. Smaller. Handwritten. I knew the penmanship instantly. General Cole. Rear Admiral. It read, "Most have forgotten, but I have not. There's a memorial coming. I'll speak the words you never could." I folded the letter, the edges trembling between my fingers. The clock ticked from the kitchen, each second cutting through the quiet. 25 years of silence, built on the belief that truth could destroy more than it could heal. But lately, that silence felt heavier than the truth itself. I knew then I would go to Charleston, not to explain, not to fix, but to witness what I had avoided all my life. Before I left, another package arrived from an old Navy return address. Inside was a worn envelope, edges frayed, the paper soft from time. The handwriting was hurried, uneven. Jacob's. I hope Dad doesn't stay angry at Deborah. The first line read, "She did what no one else had the courage to do." I pressed the letter to my chest. It smelled faintly of salt, of distance, of something long gone. I slipped it into my bag. I didn't yet know why, but some part of me understood. This memorial would not belong to Jacob alone. Charleston greeted me with pale sunlight and the smell of damp wood. The memorial hall by the harbor was already full. Veterans in uniform, families in black, reporters whispering from the back. I arrived early, choosing the last row, the seat no one notices. On stage, my father stood straighter than I remembered, gray hair combed with precision, tie perfectly aligned. His voice carried effortlessly through the speakers. Jacob Lawson was the kind of man our family was built on. Brave, loyal, steadfast. He paused, a faint smile forming. "And my daughter, she once tried the Navy, but it wasn't for her. Some people just aren't made for that kind of pressure." A few polite laughs rolled through the room. My mother's head dropped, her hand clutching the hem of her dress. I kept my eyes on my lap. My hands didn't shake, but they felt heavy, as if I were holding something invisible, something I'd carried too long. The band struck up the ceremonial hymn, the steady beat of drums filling the air. Then General Cole walked to the podium. He spoke about sacrifice, about the quiet heroes history forgets. His gaze swept across the crowd, unhurried, deliberate. Then it stopped, on me. I felt the weight of recognition before he even said it. "Before we continue," he said, voice firm, "I want to acknowledge someone in this room, someone who served this country for over 2 decades. Rear Admiral Deborah Lawson." Every sound vanished. 200 SEALs rose from their seats in perfect unison. The flag behind them rippled in the draft from the open door. I stayed seated, still as stone. My father's eyes found me, wide, uncomprehending. I stood slowly, meeting General Cole's gaze, and nodded once in return. No smile. No words. Just a gesture that belonged to a life most here would never understand. He looked back to the crowd. Some choose silence, so others may be praised. But today, that silence deserves to be honored. My father's shoulders sank. His hand gripped the edge of the chair. My mother began to cry quietly, the sound barely reaching me. Across the rows of uniforms, a young SEAL leaned toward another and whispered, "Meridian." She wrote the Meridian plan. I saw the realization ripple down the line like a wave breaking over the room. When the ceremony ended, General Cole stepped off the stage without shaking hands or posing for photos. He walked straight toward me, stopping beside my row. He spoke softly enough for only me to hear. "He talked about you often," he said. "More than you think." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. He turned and left, his footsteps echoing through the hall. The room was utterly still again. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy with shame. It was the kind that follows truth once it finally finds its way out. After General Cole's words, the room felt stripped of oxygen. Every shuffle of fabric, every hesitant breath rang louder than the speeches that came before. I stood still, eyes on the flags behind the stage, the light pouring through the skylight, painting the folds of red and white across the ceiling. For a moment, I wasn't thinking about rank or recognition. I was thinking about Jacob, his crooked grin, the way he used to say he'd make our father proud enough for both of us. I lowered my head in acknowledgement, then sat down again. General Cole continued his address as if nothing had shifted. "A nation's strength," he said, "does not come only from those who fight at the front, but from those who keep everything standing in the dark." Each line landed like a quiet strike, meant less for the crowd than for one man sitting rigid in the front row. I didn't need to look to know my father's shoulders had locked in place. When the ceremony ended, no one spoke. The scraping of chairs, the echo of boots, every sound felt hollow. People began filing out, their murmurs tentative, careful. I rose, moving toward the corridor without waiting for anyone's gaze. Outside, the air was sharp, the wind off the harbor biting at my skin. I walked to the railing, the sea silvered by sunlight, the kind of cold that forces truth to the surface. Behind me, a voice broke through the wind. "Ma'am!" I turned. A young officer stood there, hat tucked beneath his arm, posture straight. His voice was steady, but his eyes gave him away. "Meridian saved my team. We never knew who planned it." "Thank you," I gave a small nod. "That's how it should be." He returned the gesture with quiet respect. And for a heartbeat, that was enough. As I turned back toward the water, I saw my father in the doorway of the hall. His hand gripped the edge of his jacket. His expression stripped bare, confused, almost lost. My mother reached to touch his shoulder, but he pulled away. We held each other's gaze for a moment, his heavy with years of certainty collapsing, mine unwilling to reach for comfort. Then I walked past him, the space between us filled with everything neither of us had said. By the time I reached the parking lot, my phone vibrated. A message flashed across the screen. "We need to talk. Dad." I didn't answer. Real conversations don't happen with people who haven't yet learned how to listen. That night, from my hotel room overlooking the harbor, I watched the city lights flicker across the water. The wind was softer now, almost kind. I remembered something an old commanding officer once told me. "Silence isn't absence, Lawson. It's discipline under pressure." For the first time, I wondered if it was time to let that silence speak, not to prove anything, but to finally set it free. The sun was sinking when the phone rang. I knew before answering who it was. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up. "Deborah," my father said, his voice hoarse, unsteady. "Yes, sir," I answered. There was a pause that stretched so long, I thought the line had gone dead. Then he asked, low, uncertain, "Why didn't you tell me? After all these years, why?" I looked out over the water, the sky bleeding into gold. "Because you never asked," I said. I heard him exhale, rough and uneven. Then his voice cracked. "I made you feel small in front of everyone, and yet you're the one making me feel small now. No one makes anyone small," I said quietly. "We just spend years standing at the wrong angles." He was silent, and for a moment I could almost hear him thinking. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. Softer, humbled. "Jacob knew," he said. "In the letter he sent, he wrote your title. I never read it, until this morning." I closed my eyes. I didn't need to ask who had handed it to him. General Cole had always known what needed to happen and when. "Now I understand," my father continued. "Your silence, it wasn't weakness." "No," I said. "It was how I kept people safe." He breathed out slowly, the sound of years collapsing into something human. "Come home, Deborah. We need to talk. I'm making dinner." When the call ended, another message lit up my screen from an unfamiliar number. From Jen. "Cole. He needed to hear it from you." I set the phone down, my hand trembling in a way it hadn't on any battlefield. It wasn't just the truth that had been spoken. It was the man who'd once measured worth by volume finally learning how to hear. I stepped out onto the balcony. The harbor glowed red under the dying sun. I thought of Jacob, of my father, of the years swallowed by silence. The air was warm, heavy with salt. "Tomorrow," I whispered to the wind, "I'll go home." The sun was low when I crossed the marsh bridge, its light spilling gold over the still water. The old family house waited ahead, roof faded, porch peeling, the air thick with salt and pine. My mother met me at the door, her smile small but warm. She touched my hand, then stepped aside. Inside, my father sat at the table, a single lamp burning beside an opened letter. Jacob's handwriting covered the page, edges wrinkled by shaking hands. "Your mother found this in his trunk," he said quietly. "I just read it." I sat down across from him. The light cast soft shadows across his face. "He wrote that you planned Meridian," my father continued. "He said he was proud of you." I nodded. "I know. For a long time. The only sound was the ticking clock." Then he said, barely above a whisper, "I turned your silence into failure. Can you forgive me?" "I don't need forgiveness," I said. "Just stop telling the wrong story." He smiled faintly. My mother wiped her eyes. We ate clam chowder in silence, the way families sometimes do when words are too heavy. For once, the quiet between us didn't hurt. It healed. A week later, I returned to Charleston for a small memorial honoring Jacob and his fallen brothers. I took my usual seat in the back, the folded flag resting quietly on my lap. My father walked to the podium without notes or hesitation. His voice was steady, low, and raw in a way I'd never heard before. "For years," he said, "I told the wrong story about my daughter. I told people she left the Navy. But today, I want to tell it right." The room went silent. She didn't walk away. She served this country for 25 years. In silence, in shadows, so people like us could live in the light. Around me, veterans stood, some bowing their heads, others simply watching him speak. "Honor," he said, "isn't in medals or applause. It's in living true, even when no one sees." Then he turned toward me. "If anyone asks about Deborah Lawson, tell them she never gave up. She stood where silence needed to stand." I didn't move. I just touched the flag on my lap and felt peace settle where guilt once lived. Afterward, General Cole clasped my hand. "Sometimes others must speak for us," he said. "That too is honor." 2 years later, my father passed away in his sleep. Peaceful, like a ship drifting out with the tide. When I emptied his dresser, I found a folded note tucked into his shirt pocket. My daughter never dropped out. She rose higher than I ever dared to dream. I folded it carefully and placed it inside the wooden box that held Jacob's medals. 2 pieces of honor, one forged in light, the other in silence. The next morning, I walked to the harbor. The water was still, a mirror of pale blue sky. A training ship eased away from the dock. Young cadets in crisp whites raising their hands in salute. I didn't return the gesture. I simply smiled. Some victories don't need applause, I whispered. Some truths stand quietly and never fall. The wind was warm, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Somewhere beyond the waves, I could almost hear Jacob laughing. For the first time in years, the past didn't feel heavy. I closed my eyes. Silence, at last, had become home.